There is a moment when the architecture of the human soul breaks down, not with the roar of metal twisting, but with the silence of a surrender so complete that even the memory of resistance dissolves into nothingness. This is not a poetic metaphor, nor a dramatic exaggeration. It is the clinical description of a process that the architects of power have perfected over millennia. A process as old as the first civilizations and as contemporary as the latest scandal revealed in today's news. The question is not whether total control over the human mind is possible. History has already answered that question with a catalog of atrocities so extensive that listing them becomes tedious. The real question, the one no one wants to ask aloud, is this: how much is needed to turn a person into a willing accomplice of their own destruction? The answer takes us to territories where psychology meets cruelty, where the scientific method merges with systematic brutality, and where we discover that domination does not require physical chains. It requires something much more sophisticated, something that works from within, dismantling piece by piece the structure that a person calls self. The powerful, those architects of control who operate both in palaces and in dungeons, both in corporations and in families, have understood a fundamental truth that modern psychology is only beginning to map accurately. The human mind does not need to be destroyed to be dominated. It needs to be reconstructed, reconfigured, transformed into an instrument that sings the melody of its own captivity. History offers us perfect laboratories to study this phenomenon. In medieval castles, in the harems of the Ottoman Empire, on plantations in the southern United States, in Nazi concentration camps, in the political prisons of totalitarian regimes, in the basements of contemporary traffickers. Each of these scenarios, separated by centuries and geographies, shares an identical psychological structure. They are not disconnected historical aberrations. They are variations of the same experiment, repeated over and over again, refined with each iteration, perfected until they become an unwritten but devastatingly effective science. It always begins with the capture, the moment when a person is torn from their known reality and immersed in an environment where all previous rules cease to apply. This is not merely a change of physical location. It is an ontological rupture, a fracture in the continuity of being. The person who crosses that threshold, whether pushed, deceived, or dragged, enters a space where their previous identity is invalid. The names they used, the roles they played, the certainties that define them, all become irrelevant in an instant. This first blow is not against the body. It is against the very sense of personal continuity, against the internal narrative that a person has built throughout their life to answer the question, who am I? The disorientation that follows is not accidental. It is designed. In military interrogation manuals, in protocols of destructive sects, in documented patterns of domestic abusers, we find the same technique applied with minor variations, altering the sense of time, keeping the person in a state of constant vigilance where they can never predict what will come next. Sleep is interrupted at irregular intervals. Food arrives without a discernible pattern. Light and darkness alternate without following the natural rhythm of day and night. This is not impulsive cruelty. It is deliberate psychological engineering. The human brain, that tireless prediction machine, begins to fail when it is denied the ability to anticipate. And when it fails, something fundamental breaks: the sense of agency, the illusion that we have some control over our destiny. But the true genius of total domination does not reside in the initial disorientation. It resides in what comes after, in the phase that modern psychologists, with their sanitized language, call operant conditioning, and which in practice translates into something much more visceral. The captor begins to present himself not as an absolute enemy, but as the only possible source of relief in a universe of suffering. This is the central paradox of psychological domination. The executioner must become a savior. The hand that inflicts pain must be the same that occasionally stops it. When hunger becomes unbearable, it is the captor who offers food. When the cold bites the bones, it is the captor who provides a blanket. When isolation threatens to completely shatter the psyche, It is the captor who grants a few minutes of conversation, of human recognition. This pattern has a name in psychological literature: Stockholm Syndrome. But that term, coined after a bank robbery in Sweden in 1973, barely scratches the surface of a much deeper and older phenomenon. What actually happens in these scenarios is not that the victim develops irrational affection towards their captor. It is that their brain, desperate to find patterns that allow it to survive, correctly identifies that cooperation with the captor is the only viable strategy. It is not stupidity or weakness. It is adaptation. It is the human mind doing exactly what it evolved to do, finding the path of least harm in a hostile environment. The architects of dominance understand this intuitively. They know they don't need to completely break a person. They need to create an incentive structure where submission feels like the most rational choice. Every act of obedience is rewarded, not always, not predictably, but enough to keep hope alive. This pattern of intermittent reinforcement is the most powerful in learning psychology. It is the same principle that makes slot machines addictive, the same that keeps people compulsively checking their phones, the same applied in these psychological dungeons. Unpredictable reward creates a stronger bond than constant reward because the brain remains in a state of perpetual anticipation, always waiting for the next moment of relief. As this conditioning takes root, another more insidious process progresses in parallel: the erosion of prior identity. This requires more than simply denying the person the use of their name or stripping them of their possessions. It requires systematically attacking every element that constituted their sense of self. If the person defined themselves by their intelligence, they are placed in situations where that intelligence proves useless or counterproductive. If they took pride in their moral strength, they are forced to make decisions where all options are degrading. If they found identity in their body, in their physical autonomy, that body becomes occupied territory, something that no longer belongs to them. The most sophisticated perpetrators understand that extreme physical violence is counterproductive to total domination. A body too badly damaged may die, and a dead body is useless. But more importantly, extreme and constant violence can create a terrible clarity in the victim. The clarity that there is no hope, that there is no behavior that can improve their situation, and therefore they have nothing to lose. And a person with nothing to lose is dangerous, unpredictable, uncontrollable. The goal is not to destroy. The goal is to rebuild. This reconstruction is achieved through a process that psychologists who study brainwashing have thoroughly documented. First, as we have already established, comes the demolition of the previous identity. Then comes the liminal phase, that ambiguous space where the person is no longer who they were but has not yet adopted a new identity. It is in this void, in this suspension of being, where the captor introduces the new frames of reference, the new truths. The outside world, the place from which the person was torn away, begins to be redefined not as a home to return to, but as a place that rejected them, abandoned them, and never truly valued them. The captor, in contrast, is presented as someone who sees them, who understands their true value, even if that value is expressed through their usefulness for the captor's purposes. This cognitive reconfiguration does not happen through logical arguments. It occurs through the constant repetition of certain messages during moments of extreme vulnerability. When a person is exhausted, hungry, terrified, their cognitive defenses are at their lowest point. The ideas planted in those moments take root deeply, not in the prefrontal cortex where critical thinking occurs, but in more primitive structures of the brain that process threat and survival. That is why victims of this type of domination can, years after escaping, continue to feel loyalty towards their captors, continue to defend the narratives imposed on them, continue to feel that somehow they deserved what happened to them. Guilt is perhaps the most powerful instrument in this psychological arsenal. Skilled captors do not need to convince their victims that the captor is good. They need to convince the victim that she is bad. Every forced act of submission is reframed as a voluntary choice. Every betrayal imposed on one's own values becomes evidence of the victim's inherent corruption. The logic is circular, but devastating. If you were truly a good person, you would have resisted. You did not resist. Therefore, you are not a good person. Therefore, you deserve what is happening to you. This inversion, where the victim takes responsibility for the perpetrator's actions, is the ultimate triumph of psychological domination. Historical records are full of examples that confirm these patterns. In imperial harems, captured and enslaved women not only came to identify with their captors, but also actively perpetuated the system, fiercely competing for the sultan's attention, sabotaging other prisoners, internalizing the power structure that had enslaved them. On slave plantations, some slaves assumed supervisory roles, punishing other slaves with more cruelty than the masters themselves, having internalized the hierarchy so completely that their only way to feel any power was by exercising it over those lower in that chain of degradation. This phenomenon repeats itself on smaller but equally devastating scales in contemporary contexts. In cases of domestic abuse that last for decades. In sects where members not only stay voluntarily, but actively recruit new victims. In toxic work environments where employees passionately defend organizations that systematically exploit them. The mechanism is identical, only the scale and specific context change. What makes this process particularly effective is its ability to self-reinforce. Once the person has internalized the narrative of their own deserving of abuse, once they have taken on the guilt for their situation, they become their own jailer. They no longer need external guards. The bars are in their mind. Any thought of escape is immediately met with an internal voice, a voice that paradoxically sounds like their own, but repeats with perfect fidelity the script installed by the captor. You wouldn't survive out there. No one else would love you. After what you've done, what you've become, this is the only place you can be. Modern neuroscience has begun to map the physical changes in the brain that correspond to this psychological domain. Chronic trauma alters the very structure of the hippocampus, affecting memory formation. It modifies the amygdala, intensifying fear responses. It affects the prefrontal cortex, compromising decision-making and emotion regulation. These are not metaphorical changes. They are measurable alterations, observable in brain scans. The psychological domain leaves scars as real as any physical wound. Only these scars are invisible to the naked eye. Perpetrators of this type of domination rarely operate from a written manual. They do not need to have studied psychology or neuroscience. The transmission of these techniques occurs in a more organic, more sinister way. An abuser learns by observing another abuser. An oppressive system institutionalizes practices that work, effectively breaking resistance. Over generations, a set of methods is refined, whose effectiveness has been tested millions of times in the largest and darkest laboratory that exists, real human history. But this is where analysis must become more uncomfortable, more personal. Because psychological dominance is not just something that happens in dungeons and concentration camps. It is a spectrum. At one end, we find the most extreme and obvious manifestations. But as we move along that spectrum, we begin to recognize familiar patterns in much closer places. In the way certain parents systematically break their children's will, not with blows, but with constant criticism, conditioned love, and the perpetual threat of emotional abandonment. In the way some educational institutions do not educate but domesticate, rewarding obedience and punishing independent thought. In the way certain work environments cultivate a culture where employees compete to prove who can sacrifice more of themselves, who can internalize the organization's goals more completely as if they were their own. The question this raises is so obvious that it is terrifying. How much of what we consider normal socialization is simply a diluted version of these techniques of domination? When exactly does the line cross between teaching a person to function in society and breaking their will to make them obedient? The mechanisms are the same. Intermittent rewards, unpredictable punishments, erosion of autonomy, internalization of external norms, guilt as a control instrument. The only difference is the degree, the intensity, the explicit intention. The Cynic philosophers, particularly Schopenhauer, understood something fundamental about human nature that modern psychology is rediscovering with more sophisticated terminology, but identical conclusions. The will, that force that drives us to exist, to persist, to seek, is also our greatest vulnerability, because a will can be redirected, captured, put at the service of other purposes without the person even perceiving that they have lost their freedom. In fact, the most perfect form of domination is one where the dominated sincerely believe they are acting by their own choice, that their desires are genuinely theirs and not carefully cultivated installations by external forces. This understanding explains why releasing situations of extreme domination is so complex. It's not simply about opening the doors of physical prison. A person can be physically free, but remain psychologically chained for decades. Therapists working with survivors of extreme abuse know that the recovery process is neither linear nor guaranteed. Many victims return to their abusers, not out of stupidity, but because the outside world feels more terrifying than the familiar hell. The brain reconstructed within captivity does not know how to function outside of it. The identity formed under domination does not have the tools to navigate freedom. There is also the phenomenon that researchers call intergenerational trauma. Mothers who survived extreme domination pass patterns to their children, not genetically, but behaviorally. The children grow up in environments where certain types of control are normalized, where a certain way of relating to authority is established as the only possible way. And thus, without the need for physical prisons, techniques of domination are perpetuated, transmitted, and multiplied across generations. Contemporary society has developed institutional defenses against the most obvious forms of this domination. Laws against slavery, against kidnapping, against certain types of abuse. But these defenses are superficial because they attack the most visible manifestations without understanding the underlying mechanics. A captor who truly understands psychological domination can operate entirely within the bounds of the law, never leaving physical marks, never doing anything that a court can easily prosecute, yet destroying a person as completely as any medieval torturer. Social networks, for example, operate using principles almost identical to those of intermittent conditioning that we described earlier. Unpredictable rewards. Dose social validation in a way that maximizes addiction. Alteration of the sense of self based on external metrics. I am not arguing that social networks are equivalent to totalitarian prisons. I am pointing out that the psychological mechanisms that make them effective are the same ones that have been used for centuries to break wills. The difference is in degree, not in type. Contemporary economic systems also employ sophisticated versions of these techniques. Job insecurity keeps people in a constant state of vigilance and anxiety, similar to prisoners who never know when the next punishment or reward will come. Debt functions as a form of captivity that does not require physical chains, but limits freedom as effectively as any cell. The implicit message is the same as what the captor tells the prisoner. You have no real options. Your survival depends on your cooperation with the system. Any thought of true independence is a dangerous fantasy. The most disturbing thing about all this is not that these mechanisms exist. The most disturbing is how well they work, how universally applicable they are across cultures and eras. This suggests something deeply uncomfortable about the architecture of the human mind. It suggests that we are fundamentally vulnerable to these types of manipulation, that our survival mechanisms, when systematically exploited, become our chains. The philosophical question that emerges from this analysis is whether there is such a thing as an authentic self that can be distinguished from the conditioned self. If from childhood we are all molded, conditioned, reconstructed by external forces, where exactly does genuine agency reside? Schopenhauer would argue that this very question already contains its own answer. There is no free self, only the blind will operating through us, and what we call freedom is simply ignorance of the causes that determine us. But even if we accept this pessimistic philosophical conclusion, there remains a practical distinction between types of conditioning. There is a difference between being shaped by a community that, at least in theory, seeks your development as a capable person who can function and contribute, versus being systematically broken by someone whose sole goal is your total submission. This difference may not be philosophically fundamental, but it is existentially crucial. Survivors of extreme domination who manage to regain something resembling autonomy do so through a painful process of recognition. They must first identify the voices in their heads that are not theirs, the internalized scripts that were installed in them. Then they must question them, one by one, carefully dismantling the mental structure that was built during their captivity. This process can take years, decades, and is never complete. The scars remain. Once established, thought patterns leave deep grooves that are easily reactivated under stress. But here is where the analysis must turn towards you, towards the one receiving this message. Because the temptation, when hearing about extreme psychological dominance, is to put it at a safe distance. That is, this is something that happens to other people, in extreme situations, in contexts I will never experience. But that distance is illusory. The mechanisms we have dissected operate on a spectrum of intensity, and all of us exist somewhere on that spectrum. Every time you act against your best judgment because you fear social rejection, you are experiencing a diluted form of that dominance. Every time you defend a system that exploits you because you have internalized its logic, you are reproducing the patterns of the prisoner who defends her captor. Every time you silence your own inner voice because it contradicts what you have been taught to believe about yourself, you are operating from that same conditioning structure. The difference between you and the victim of total domination is not of type, but of degree. It's not that you are free and she is chained. It is that your chains are more subtle, more socially acceptable, easier to rationalize. But the fundamental mechanics are identical. Your behavior is being modulated by systems of reward and punishment that you did not design. Your sense of identity is built on narratives that were handed to you, not discovered. Your desires have been cultivated by forces that have their own interests, not necessarily alienated from yours. The question then, the one that should keep you awake tonight, is this: how much of what you believe you are is truly yours? How many of the decisions you make daily are genuinely autonomous versus responses conditioned to stimuli that you don't even consciously recognize? At what exact moment did your socialization cross the line into something that dangerously resembles the kind of psychological reconstruction experienced by victims of extreme domination? I'm not suggesting that we are all equivalent victims, nor that all forms of social influence are equally harmful. But I am saying that the continuum exists, that the mechanisms are the same, and that the only real difference is how much direct and explicit control the conditioning agent exercises. And I am saying that recognizing this, truly confronting this reality, requires a level of brutal honesty that very few are willing to achieve. Because once you recognize the bars of your own cage, once you identify the specific mechanisms through which your behavior has been shaped, you face an impossible choice. You can try to free yourself, knowing that process will be painful, uncertain, and possibly unsuccessful. Or you can return to ignorance, re-rationalize your chains as genuine preferences, convince yourself that your conditioning is truly who you are. Most choose the second option. It is more comfortable. It is more sustainable. It is what allows you to sleep at night. The architects of total domain know it. They know that even when you present the naked truth of manipulation, most people will choose not to see it. Because seeing it requires recognizing how little real control they have over their own minds. And that truth is more terrifying than almost any physical prison. A person can survive years in a cell, keeping alive the flame of their internal resistance. But how do you resist when the prison is inside you? When the commands you follow come from a voice that sounds exactly like yours but was installed by others? This is the perfect form of domination. Not the one that requires armed guards and high walls. The one that self-reproduces in each person's mind, transmitted from generation to generation, refined with each iteration, becoming increasingly subtle and therefore more inescapable. Victims of total domination in dungeons at least know they are prisoners. They have a clear enemy, an identifiable captor, a clear line between their will and the imposed one. But when conditioning is sufficiently complete, when it is normalized and integrated into the very fabric of society, you don't even have the clarity to know what you should be resisting. So, the final question is not whether total psychological domination is possible. History has already shown that it is not only possible, but also replicable, scalable, and terribly effective. The question is whether you can recognize its manifestations in your own life. If you can identify the moments when your will was captured without realizing it, if you can distinguish between your genuine desires and those that were cultivated in you to serve external purposes, and if, after that recognition, you have the courage to do something about it, or if you will simply close your eyes and return to the comfort of your family chains. Because in the end, the darkest lesson of all this is that most people, when shown the key to their cell, choose to stay inside. Not because the door is closed, but because outside, in what we call freedom, the terror of being truly responsible for oneself turns out to be more unbearable than any captivity.